Hey y'all! In North Georgia, there's a lake with so many unfortunate occurrences, it has actually been dubbed the world's most haunted lake. It is even rumored to be cursed by many locals who are afraid to visit even its shores. I'm Candace, and I'll be your guide. Lake Lanier sits nestled in the southern foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, about an hour north of Atlanta. Named after poet and Confederate soldier Sidney Lanier, it has been dubbed the world's most haunted lake. Given the history of the land it sits upon, this is an unsurprising title. Forsyth County, occupying the western portion of the lake, was once part of the Cherokee Nation. But in the 1830s, most of its members were exiled by the U.S. government along the southeastern portion of the Trail of Tears. Several decades later, another expulsion would occur. Until 1912, about 1,100 Black people were land and business owners in Forsyth County. However, on September 9, 1912, an 18-year-old white woman named May Crow was raped and murdered at her home on the banks of the Chattahoochee River in a village called Oscarville. Officials handled what should have been an investigation by rounding up the 4 Black Oscarville residents who lived nearest May: 2 teenage boys, 1 young man, and 1 woman, and imprisoning them. One of these men mentioned was Robert Edwards. A day after his arrest, a mob of angry white men attacked him in his cell, shooting him before dragging him through the streets and hanging him from a telephone pole in Cumming, Georgia. Between Crow's murder and Edwards' lynching, violence begat violence, and soon white mobs known at the time as night riders began storming through the county with guns and torches, burning churches and Black-owned businesses and demanding that Black residents vacate the county immediately. For their safety, the residents were forced to flee with only what they could carry easily, abandoning their crops and land to flee in the night. Considering so many of these families were sharecroppers, they were leaving their entire livelihoods behind. What remained was pillaged by the night riders. A month later, jurors only took 1 hour to convict the 2 teenage boys of the rape and murder of May Crow. Charges against the young woman who was also accused were dropped at that time. A massive crowd of 5,000 people gathered to watch the 2 teenage boys be hanged. Needless to say, it's widely believed that all of the accused were innocent of these crimes. Decades later, in the 1950s, officials were looking for a solution to flooding issues from the Chattahoochee River, as well as seeking a reliable source of drinking water for the Atlanta area, and the idea for Lake Lanier was born. To free up the land required for this massive undertaking, 50,000 acres of land needed to be acquired, spanning 4 North Georgia counties. Purchasing this land meant displacing 250 Black families and 15 businesses. The government assured them they were being offered a fair price for their land, but understandably, the families felt a price could not be placed upon land that had been handed down through the generations. A lot of feelings accompanied the move by area residents. They were angry, anxious, and resentful. To them, their land was priceless. Of course, their feelings didn't really matter, as the government seized the land by eminent domain. In addition to the homes and businesses that would have to be cleared to make room for the lake, there were 20 cemeteries occupying the land. The Army Corps of Engineers hired help to move all of the graves that they could. Staff reached out to descendants of those buried in the plots for consent to move the graves, and largely this was obtained. However, some of the graves were very old and were either unmarked or permission just couldn't be obtained by any descendants. These graves, unfortunately, could not be moved. Of the ones that could be moved, Former staff report the caskets were decaying and they crumbled as they tried to move them, leaving the Corps of Engineers staff to attempt to gather the remains by handfuls from the rotting casket and soil below. Over the 5 years that it took for this process of acquiring the 50,000 acres and moving as many graves as possible, the Corps of Engineers was also busy removing anything that could float or was tall enough to potentially damage boats. Remember, the town of Oscarville still remained in the area they were planning to flood to create the lake. Streetlights, benches, and the spire at the town church had to be removed to prevent potential hazards from the impending flood zone. Finally, in 1956, the Beaufort Dam was built, creating Lake Lanier. Almost immediately upon its completion, the tragedies began. You see, when the land was prepared for the creation of the lake, it was hardly prepared at all. Sure, they moved some graves and some floating objects, but the village remained. Under the surface of Lake Lanier lies intact buildings, walls, fences, statues, even an intact racetrack complete with bleachers for the fans. With only some exceptions, the town was just flooded as is. These factors have earned the lake its dual reputation, not only as the most haunted lake, but also as the most dangerous underwater surface in the United States. On top of having an entire town intact, there are also underwater forests, with trees as high as 60 feet tall still rooted in the lake bed. The topography is also really hilly and unpredictable there in the foothills, and it isn't unusual to be in knee-deep water, walk out a few feet, and then suddenly the lake bed plummets 30 feet underneath you. There are areas of uneven footing so extreme that there are pockets where the lake drops to 150 to 200 feet deep. As you can imagine, with this much going on underwater, times of drought are incredibly dangerous. Much of these submerged structures were in fact discovered as water receded in 2007 during a drought, exposing the stadium seating for the racetrack. Almost immediately upon its opening, the lake began claiming victims. Since 1956, there have been approximately 700 drownings. Yes, it is a very busy recreational area, drawing about 8 million visitors per year. But for some perspective, Lake Allatoona to the west has about 7 million visitors per year and only has 1/3 the number of deaths. Out of the hundreds of known drownings at the lake, at least 27 of those bodies are still unaccounted for by most recent approximations. When the lake bottom is covered by forests, buildings, chicken coops, strung fishing lines, sunken boats, and literal piles of debris, dredging the bottom is an impossibility. In fact, amongst all of the junk at the bottom are bodies hidden in the murky water. Experienced diver Buck Buchanan once told local media, quote, "You reach out into the dark and you feel an arm or a leg and it doesn't move. Nobody has been able to lay them to rest. They're on the bottom of Lanier. Hopefully you find them before they find you." Unquote. I think it's an appropriate time to remind you this lake was created as both flood management as well as to provide drinking water to the Atlanta area. So many of the drownings and deaths that happen at Lake Lanier are strange and just outright unexplainable. Oftentimes, a person who is a strong swimmer just steps off the bank and is never seen again. Sometimes bodies are recovered miles away from the area where the person went missing. People who have survived near drownings at Lanier often claim that they felt as if they were being pulled underwater by an unseen force. Some also report feeling their chest being squeezed, restricting their breath as they were being pulled underwater. Celebrities are not exempt from the dark forces of the haunted lake. In 2012, Kyle Glover, the 11-year-old stepson of R&B artist Usher, was killed at Lake Lanier when a jet ski collided with his inner tube. The driver of the jet ski was later prosecuted for homicide by vessel, amongst other charges. Last year, Greenville College basketball player Dorian Pinson was visiting Lanier when he and 2 others jumped into the water from their pontoon boat. The wind was high that day, and the wind prevented the 3 from returning to their boat. The other 2 were rescued by another vessel, but when Dorian jumped and was submerged, he just never resurfaced. There was great difficulty locating his body after the fact, and his family got assistance from an organization called Bruce's Legacy out of Wisconsin that specializes in location and recovery of difficult-to-recover drowning cases. Occasionally, there is a mysterious boating accident where a boat randomly explodes, catches on fire, or capsizes without explanation. Sometimes passing motorists in their cars will lose control of their vehicle, strangely swerving into the lake. In addition, bizarre creatures have been reported under the surface, such as catfish as big as cars. As you could expect, with such a dark history tainting this land and the number of known deaths being so high, some believe the lake is haunted by lost souls. Some suspect it's the spirits of those buried beneath the lake bottom. Some think it's the souls of the nearly 700 deaths that have happened at the lake, and others believe it is specifically the specters of the unrecovered bodies in the depths. Many believe there's something greater at play, and that the lake itself is cursed as a result of its dark history. The most famous haunting is the Lady of Lake Lanier. In 1958, 2 years after the lake's creation, Delia Parker Young and Susie Roberts sped away from a gas station, scurrying away without paying on their way to a bar in Dawsonville, Georgia. In their haste, they careened off what is now known as the Jerry D. Jackson Bridge and crashed into the murky depths below. 18 months later, a fisherman found a bloated, decomposing body floating underneath the bridge, missing 2 toes and both hands. Some reports say that she was also missing both eyes. At the time, the body couldn't be identified, but locals knew exactly who the body belonged to because they could identify the spirit of Delia roaming the area of Highway 53 where the car left the road, wearing her blue dress and missing both hands. People say she looks like she's searching for something. Finally, in 1990, work began to repair the Jerry D. Jackson Bridge. As workers dredged the bottom of the lake underneath the bridge to create new support structures, they found a 1954 Ford half buried in the mud below. Susie Roberts' skeleton was still inside. After dental records confirmed Susie's identification, finally they could place a name to the unknown woman's body found in the water decades earlier. The unmarked tomb could finally be labeled as Delia Parker Young, the Lady of Lake Lanier. Multiple people have also reported seeing a shadowy, robed figure on a wooden raft in the lake. He uses a long stick to slowly push the boat forward in the water, inch by inch, holding a lantern to guide himself with in the dark. Some claim to hear the bells from the submerged church ringing, dampened by the sound of the murky water. A Corps of Engineers spokesperson has stated this is impossible, since, as mentioned previously, any structures tall enough to interfere with boats was removed. Although, remember, the goal of the lake was to create a reservoir of drinking water, not to create a recreational area. Perhaps if that had been their goal, such a death trap wouldn't have been created, huh? All right, y'all. That's the dark story of Lake Lanier. Let's talk about it. So the first thing I want to say is, as I was researching sources for the story, I did come across some comments on some of the articles of people who were angry about the representation of the lake's history. And all I can say is history is ugly. If the history you're learning is not ugly, at least a large part of the time, you're not learning history. It's really unfortunate, but I'm always going to be honest with y'all. If I find multiple sources backing up one claim, that's what I'm going to tell you about. I'm not going to try to color anyone's perception of how the past looked. I'm just going to tell you what I've learned. While officials claim that people were paid what the land was worth when it was seized by eminent domain, that number is probably way less than what the actual value should have been. There is an unverified source that said if the townspeople had 5 acres or less, regardless of any structures that could have been present on that 5 acres, they went entirely unpaid. Again, that's an unverified source. It was a person whose grandfather worked on creating the lake, and that's what he told him. So I'm not sure if that's true or not, but either way, you can imagine that they were not paid what the land was actually valued at. So y'all, I know how water treatment works, but the idea that there are 27, likely more than 27 corpses in the drinking source for Atlanta is absolutely disgusting. The 27 are the known drowning victims that haven't been recovered, but you know there are more that are not known. One thing that was mentioned is sometimes people go to Lake Lanier to, we'll just say, to end things. And also there are people who drive off into the lake and are just regarded as missing people. So we know there are more than 27, but don't know how many are actually in there. There are numerous corpses in the drinking water of the city of Atlanta, so I am very happy I don't drink that water. And the Corps of Engineers says that there's no way the church bells could be chiming because all the tall structures were removed, but they left 60-foot tall trees. I don't know how much I even believe about all of this anymore. The college basketball player is a great example of how strong and able-bodied people just disappear under the surface of the water there. You know, just because he is a basketball player doesn't necessarily mean he's a good swimmer, but it does mean at least he's young and healthy and strong and very able-bodied. And he just jumped into the water and never came back up. The wind prevented all 3 from getting back to the boat. How strong was that wind? Was that like gale force hurricane wind on a lake? Because I cannot understand how this happened. The other 2 had to be rescued by another boat, so it must have been pretty intense. I couldn't really find anything to clarify just how bad that wind was for this to play out the way it did. So the big question, is it cursed? Is it haunted? The dark history of the place would make it make sense that it's one or the other or both. You had the expulsion of the natives, the expulsion of the blacks in town, and submerging graves and many abrupt sudden deaths. It makes perfect sense that it could be. However, although I found lots of sources about the Lady of Lake Lanier and the man in the raft, I found no experiences of people who've actually seen these things. Only articles written about each of them and how they're commonly seen. Typically, something that's commonly seen, people will talk about it. So it definitely gives the feeling that these are more urban legends rather than something that is experienced by people. Now, granted, it could be that the people who experience the bad things at Lanier all drown. So that could be the case, but I don't think that that's the case here. So no, I don't believe it's haunted. I feel like the lake bed being the way it is, full of debris and, an entire city, leads to the inevitable dangers that I've been sitting here telling you about. And if two of the most common ghosts in the lake exist, then nobody's talking about them. So it does seem to me to be urban legends of the lake. It's almost like all the ingredients are there to suggest a curse, but all those ingredients don't get cooked up into an actual curse. It's just a lot of really sad, tragic realities. But, I want to know what you think. Do you think Lake Lanier is cursed? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. You can find me on social media at obscureappalachia. Check out the Instagram and Facebook pages for some photos from today's episode. If you love the podcast, please leave a review and tell your friends about it. And if you'd like to support me, you can do that over on Patreon at patreon.com/obscureappalachia. I'm having a ton of fun over there creating bonus content for the patrons. Feel free to email me anytime at obscureappalachia@gmail.com. I love hearing from y'all. Until next time.